Hi guys, in this episode of Shri series, we'll talk about algebra and more specifically multiplying and dividing expressions. What we've got is we've got three questions, A, B, and C. Both involve multiplication, one involves division. Now, before I go further into solving this, there are a few points I wanted to make. I mentioned in the previous video, suppose you've got A plus A. Now, both are like terms and therefore that's going to be 2A. Another question, suppose you've got 2A plus 3A, right? That's the same as going to a shop, you buy 2 apples and then you buy another 3 apples. Altogether, you're going to get 5 apples. The fact is that both the apples are like terms and therefore you can add them. So in this situation, 2A plus 3A, the first question you need to ask yourself is, are these pairs like terms? And if they're like terms, as I mentioned in the previous video, you can add them, all right, or simplify them. In this case, 2A plus 3A becomes 5A. Suppose we have A times A. What does that become? All right, now using the laws of indices, that's the same as 1 and 1 in terms of the power. So A times A therefore becomes A 1 plus 1. So you're simply adding the powers and that becomes A squared. All right. Let's say you've got A times B, for example. Now we know very well if I was to put A plus B, you can't simplify that, all right, because they're unlike terms, all right. However, when you got A times B, you can simplify that and that becomes A B. So please be mindful that in addition and subtraction, all right, you cannot simplify unlike terms, but in multiplication, like in this case, you can simplify and therefore the answer becomes AB. All right, so with that in mind, let's look at this question. 2h times 7i. Now, obviously, in terms of addition, both these pairs are unlike terms. However, in multiplication, you can simplify them. So what we need to do in this question is you times or multiply the numbers first. So you go 2 times 7, which is 14. Write that. Highlight that big, and h times I, that becomes hi. All right, so please be mindful. A lot of students sort of go like 2h plus 7i and they try to simplify it, but just remember, in addition you cannot simplify. All right, you can with multiplication. So in this situation, like I said before, multiply the numbers first. So 2 times 7, which is 14, and h times I, which is hi. I can't simplify that any further, and that becomes my answer. Let's look at B, for example. Now, in B, we've got negative 3p squared r times 2pr. All right? So just like in A, what we need to do is we times the numbers. All right? So we got negative 3 and 2. Now remember, in basic maths, when you multiply a negative by a positive number, you will get a negative number. If it's a negative by a negative number, you get a positive. In this situation, it's negative 3 times 2, therefore that's negative 6. All right? And then you've got p squared and p. Now, just remember p squared times p. Think of p as 1. If you don't have a power, assume it's 1. And using the laws of indices, when you've got powers and you times them, you simply add the power, and therefore that's going to be p2 plus 1, and therefore that's going to be p cubed. So in this situation, p squared times p simply becomes p cubed. You've got r times r. You can go like that. So there are no powers, it's r1 times r1. Therefore, that's r1 plus 1, which is r squared. So the answer eventually becomes negative 6 p cubed r squared. I can't simplify that further, so we'll leave my answer like that. The last question here is a division question. You got negative 7xy over 14y. Now obviously negative 7 divided by 14, that's the first thing you need to do. You simplify the numbers. It reminds you of simplifying fractions to its lowest term. So technically, negative 7 over 14 is negative 1 over 2. Now you've got x, you have nothing to simplify. You have x in the numerator, but you don't have any letter down there or x in the denominator, so you leave that as an x. However, you've got y and y, they cancel out, so your final answer becomes negative 1 over 2x. So that's how we multiply and divide expressions. Just be mindful, whatever you can do with additions and subtractions does not necessarily apply for multiplication. Like we said before, a plus a becomes 2a, but then when you got a times a, that does not mean 2a, it actually becomes a squared. You can simplify a times b, which is ab, but that does not mean you can simplify a plus b, because those are unlike terms. And if you can understand that concept, then multiplying and dividing expressions in algebra becomes straightforward. Thank you. Thanks for listening.